Funding for This Is Nashville comes from you, our listeners, and Pinnacle Financial Partners, an equal housing lender, committed to the dream of home ownership with $213 million in affordable home loans made to people of low to moderate income in 2023. PNFP.com/home.
I'm Khalil Ekolona, and this is Nashville. The state of Tennessee plans to resume capital punishment tonight with the execution of Oscar Franklin Smith by lethal injection. Smith has been on death row for 32 years for the 1989 killings of his estranged wife, Judith Robert Smith, and her teenage sons, Chad and Jason Burnett. This will be the first execution since capital punishment ground to a halt when the pandemic set in back in March of 2020. Today, we'll invite a few local journalists who've been covering the death penalty for years and an attorney who has represented inmates on death row. We'll also hear from organizers who advocate for alternatives to the death penalty.
My question as we gather here in the center of Nashville, where are the Christians? Where are the conservative Christians who are so loud every day in this building talking about what books children should read in schools and talking about who should marry who? But where are you now when it comes to the lives of our brother who just a few days after Easter will be crucified by the state?
That's coming up later in the hour. But first, it's Thursday, so you know what that means.
It's time for Anna's.
That's right. Yes, our digital lead, Anna Gallegos-Cannon, joins us each week to share a roundup of your feedback, which we collect on Twitter at This Is Nashville, on Instagram at This Is Nashville_WPLN, and at WPLN News on Facebook. Okay, Anna, last Thursday, we did an episode about natural burial and Larkspur, which is one of just a dozen conservation burial grounds in the country. We invited a death doula in training and a hospital chaplain. But a few listeners pointed out at least one perspective we were missing.
That's right. Here's a tweet we got from a listener who goes by Exaggerations and they wrote, "In Jewish tradition, burial is natural. The body is dressed and prepared by community volunteers." And Rabbi Jessica Schimberg tweeted at us too. So I decided to give her a call yesterday to learn a little bit more about the Jewish tradition when it comes to natural burial.
My training as a rabbi included a lot of kind of clinical experience, like hands-on experience with people. We have to spend time in a hospital and, caring for people at end of life. And so knowing the things about kind of the very delicate and beautiful way in which we all transition at the end of life, everything that she was talking about really spoke to me. And then, that in connection with this idea of green burial, it's just like all of that is so much. I kept talking to my radio as I was listening. It's just such a Jewish way of, quote unquote, doing death.
Rabbi Schimberg walked me through the burial process, and it really reminded me of how much care Larkspur's John Christian Pfeiffer takes when returning the body to the earth.
When the soul leaves the body, that's not just that just happens. It's a slow process. And so, being with the body, washing the body, caring for the body, and wrapping the body in a shroud, very much like what was talked about here, we tend to put the body into a very simple pine wood box so that we can truly experience that, dust to dust, that returning and that nourishing the soil.
That reminds me of the cycle of life and the cycle of replenishment. And what are we to do but to continue to feed the earth and nutrients and become nutrients for future life?
Yeah, it really made me think of the quote that I think John Christian said about people returning to the roots, not only literally, but also kind of metaphorically. And I think what the rabbi said really, really fits with that.
Another episode this week that really struck our listeners was about the Black Opry. Mike Bankhead on Twitter wrote us saying, "I've never been into country as it has never spoken to me. But recently, I've been intentionally making an effort to listen more closely to this genre, above all when the artists are, to quote Mickey Guyton, black like me, rooting for at Black Opry and continued success.
We got an email from another Mike, actually, and he wrote to us saying, I'm a Gen X white guy, Nashville native, but I really appreciate this coverage. I can give you some other input. Ray Charles, his modern sounds in country and Western music, is a great example of how music transcends race. He also pointed out that sexism is something he's noticed in country music, saying that country singer Porter Wagner, who was known as Mr. Grand Ole Opry, used to refer to the women in the genre as girl singers. The role of women in country music is definitely something we should look into for a future episode.
That would be a great angle to tackle for other genres of music, too. And I have to say, Ray Charles's version of the Wichita Lineman is a classic. Search for it on Spotify or Apple Music. You won't be mad. All right, Anna, is there anything else you want to share with our listeners?
Yes, one last thing. Did you know we have a weekly newsletter?
I mean, I did. Yeah.
Well, if you don't subscribe yet, you can sign up at thisisnashville.org, and our newsletter comes out every Friday, and we receive some listener feedback, so we're going to switch things up a little bit in the newsletter, and now it will also be your exclusive look at what shows are coming up next week.
Nice. Thanks to our digital lead, Anna Gallegos-Cannon, for this roundup. Anna, we'll see you next week, same time, same place.
I'll be here if you are.
I will definitely be here. Don't forget to add us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Let's keep the comments coming. Also, fill out our community survey and let us know what topics you want us to cover at thisisnashville.org. We've got to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll turn to the history of capital punishment in our state. Oscar Smith is scheduled to be executed tonight by lethal injection, marking the first execution since before the pandemic began. Stay with us. This is Nashville.
Funding for This is Nashville comes from you, our listeners, and Music City Prep Clinic, Nashville-based provider for PrEP and offering comprehensive sexual health services in an environment designed to be safe, professional, and shame-free. Learn more at musiccityprep.org.
I'm Khalil A. Colonna, and this is Nashville. Tyler LeGrand is a local craftsman who calls himself a wood whisperer. He works out of the garage behind his home, and recently he got a call for a custom job he didn't expect.
I did get specs. It was 72 inches, so 6 foot by 30 inches wide and 22 inches deep. You make sure you get the prettiest of the wood grain facing out. I'll lay them out like this. And so what I'll do is put them on the miter saw now and just cut them to length as they need. And that's the step before we start clamping them and gluing them together. So I got to take 73 and 5/8. Where's it again? 73 and 5/8 plus an inch and 5/8. So I was commissioned to do a coffin for an upcoming execution for Oscar Smith, and I just finished completing the sides for it over the weekend, and today I need to finish completing the lid on it in order to make it fully enclosed. When they reached out to me, I didn't say yes right away, let's put it that way. I normally build anything from chairs, tables, swings, gates, anything indoor and outdoor. I like working with a number of different woods, whether it's poplar, ash, cedar being this example here specifically. It's a lot of hardwoods that really stain beautifully, and the wood grain just kind of pops, which you can see on this cedar here. I mean, it is just one of the most beautiful woods, and obviously you can smell it a mile away too. So, and it lasts forever outside too. I say this, and if you want something to last a while, and so with this being what it is, longevity is not what it's made for in mind, in a sense. The one other thing that I might have to potentially add to it is a cross, which is another big thing to think about on here too. You know, I'm not sure what religion he is, or you know, if he would want that. So, yeah. Like if I was gonna be buried in the ground, this is what I would want: some kind of cedar for myself.
After a 2-year gap in Tennessee executions, 72-year-old Oscar Smith is scheduled to die tonight around 6 p.m. His attorneys have said that there's some new DNA evidence that could help his case. But in a written statement this week, Governor Bill Lee simply said, after thorough consideration of Smith's request for clemency, he would not be intervening. Oscar Smith was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder for the 1989 killings of his estranged wife, Judith Roberts, and her teenage sons, Chad and Jason Burnett. It was a brutal murder, and just about a year after, a jury sentenced him to death. Now, today, we're not going to get too much into the case itself or the tragic loss of the 3 victims. Instead, we're going to learn more about our state's history with executions. To help, I'd like to introduce my first guest. Stephen Hale is an award-winning journalist who has covered executions for the Nashville scene. He now works as a criminal defense investigator for AK Investigations. Stephen, welcome to This is Nashville.
Thanks for having me.
So you've witnessed executions in your reporting over the years. Can you tell us what's going to happen tonight?
So Oscar Smith's being executed by lethal injection. So he'll be, and this is one of the things that has stuck with me the most from the executions I witnessed, which is that we talk a lot about, when we talk about executions, we talk about the machinery of capital punishment, but it's not machinery, it's people. And so tonight, people who work for the state of Tennessee will kill Oscar Smith, and he'll be on a gurney, and he'll get three drugs. There's 3 drugs that are used in Tennessee's lethal injection protocol. The first, and I want to choose my words carefully because this is the subject of a lot of litigation, and has been over the years. But the first is midazolam. It's a sedative. There's been a lot of debate and litigation about how powerful that drug is, if it's powerful enough to make someone unconscious so that they won't experience what comes next. But either way, that's the first drug. The second one is a paralytic. And so the media witnesses who are there, whatever witnesses will be in the room, once that paralytic is administered, won't be able to see what Mr. Smith is experiencing, if he's experiencing anything, because he'll be unable to move. And the third will stop his heart.
You know, this execution is scheduled for 6 p.m., but is that certain? What could happen between now and then?
Well, I suppose a number of things. I mean, there have certainly been cases where sort of last-minute legal jockeying occurs. The governor has already said he's not going to intervene in this case, so that doesn't look like that will be happening. But, you know, there's I suppose, a number of things that could slow that down. But in general, the execution protocol is pretty clearly laid out, and so they try to stick to that as closely as they can.
I know you didn't report much on this case, and can you help us understand how did he end up being sentenced to death back in 1990?
Well, so when he was sentenced to death, the official method of execution would have been electrocution. And so when he was sentenced to death, that's what he was sentenced to, for, as you said earlier, the murders of his estranged wife and her 2 sons. My understanding is that he's always maintained his innocence for those murders, and so we want to be clear about that. I obviously can't weigh in on that, but he has maintained that up until this week as he's tried to fight this in the courts. But people who were sentenced to death before the state adopted lethal injection now have a choice. They can choose lethal injection or the electric chair. My understanding is that Oscar Smith declined to make a choice. He was still fighting this in the courts, and so the default is now lethal injection, and so he'll be executed by lethal injection.
You know, a lot of us, I think it's fair to say most of us, have never witnessed an execution. I can imagine that it's very jarring and an emotional experience. What has it been like for you?
It's a traumatic thing to witness. I witnessed 3 executions, 1 lethal injection and 2 electrocutions. And I say it's traumatic not because I think anyone shouldn't really pity me for it. I volunteered to witness those as a reporter, and I thought it was important to bear witness to them. So I'm not a victim of that, but it is, there's no other way to put it. It's traumatic to watch someone else be killed by other people, and to do it through a window. Of course, we're on an audio medium here, but not much different than this studio is. We have a window here, and imagine on the other side of a window is a man on a gurney who is being put to death. That's basically what it's like. And for people listening to this, they can imagine that's not an image that leaves your mind very quickly or easily.
You mentioned that as a journalist, you thought it was important to witness this. Elaborate a little bit more for me.
Yeah, I think the state is killing one of its citizens. And if they're going to do that, I think I feel comfortable speaking for other journalists who witness these with me and who report on this issue. If they're going to do that, the least they can do is let other citizens watch it and not do it. It's already a very private thing. This is done in a small room in the back of the prison with a very few witnesses. And, thankfully, folks like you are covering this today. Other people have reported on it, and the public has a chance to know about it. But they don't go out of their way to make this a very public thing, the state. I think, and so in order for, if they're going to kill one of their citizens, I think it's incumbent upon some of us to watch them do it, to watch that it's done the way they say they're going to do it, and to make sure that the public hears what it looks like so that they can decide. There's a lot of debate about capital punishment, and if people are going to debate this issue, they need to know what it really looks like and feels like and sounds like when a person is put to death.
As a witness of these executions, as a resident of the state of Tennessee, what do you think we're misunderstanding, the public, or we just don't know about executions in our state?
Well, I think there's a number of things. I think that one thing that I think is broadly misunderstood is just there's a lot of misunderstandings about these men on death row. I know that's not exactly your question, but Oscar Smith is the oldest man on Tennessee's death row. This is an old man. I'm not excusing what he may have done or even weighing in on that, but a lot of people have an image of Hannibal Lecter. And if they went to death row and met any of these people, and the men on death row more than once have invited the governor to come meet with them. So this is an opportunity that people have, and I think they would find something different than they're imagining there. The second thing is that we have taken steps to make executions look like medical procedures, particularly when it comes to lethal injection. Here's a gurney, and these medicines are literally medicines. I'm saying the word medicine. They're medicines that are usually used for some kind of medical procedure to keep someone alive, say. And in this case, they're being used to put someone to death. And going into it, I might have thought, well, this is going to look like I'm watching a surgery or something, or the guy's just going to go to sleep. And it doesn't. It looks like a killing. And I think maybe people misunderstand that because it's called a lethal injection, or there's so many euphemisms used around it. But it's, even the term put to death kind of obscures it a little. It's killing someone. And it looks like that. And when you see it, that's clear.
So a group of activists held an anti-death penalty march this past Sunday, which they've done for the past 4 executions in our state. Reverend Jeannie Alexander was there, and she had some really strong words about the people who participate in executions. Let's listen.
We don't think about is that it makes murderers out of people who work for the Department of Correction. We ask that of people who work for that branch of government.
Stephen, how have you considered employees who must really be hands-on with these executions?
It's something that I have thought a lot about, especially since witnessing them. And when I was a reporter, I did some stories trying to get my arms around the trauma of the death penalty for the people who are asked to participate in it. And I think that is another thing that people can really try to understand, is that there's ripple effects of this that go out. I wouldn't dream of trying to speak for victims' families or family of the condemned, but they are affected by this. Witnesses are affected by it, and the people who are asked to carry it out are affected by it. And again, it is a hands-on thing. Staff of the Department of Corrections will go to Oscar Smith's holding cell. They'll take him out. They'll bring him. They'll strap him into a gurney. I mean, this is not something that is done from a distance. It's a very hands-on thing. And I can't speak for the people who participate in it, but I can only imagine, as traumatic as it was and upsetting as it was for me to watch it happen, I can only imagine what it's like to take part in it. And another thing to remember is that in a lot of cases, these Department of Corrections staff members will know these men. Oscar Smith's been on death row for 32 years. Some of the guards and corrections officers that work there, they know him. They talk to him. They know him as Oscar. You know, he's not an inmate. He's a guy with a name that they know in some cases, I'm sure. And so I can't imagine what that would be like.
Have you had conversations with prison staff about executions?
You know, I've had some conversations with former prison staff. I think a lot of the people who work there currently, they're not in a position where they're able to talk or willing to for whatever reason. But I have had conversations with people who have been there for executions. And, you know, again, I hesitate to say too much just because I wouldn't want to presume to speak for them. But, you know, people I've talked to have even just spoken about the sort of pall that they feel over the prison on these days when this happens. And I think that even if they are philosophically maybe agree with the death penalty or whatnot, there's no escaping the sort of brute facts of what it's being done. And I can only imagine what it's like for them. And they have to go home after that, just like everyone else. And so, yeah, I think what the Reverend was saying in that audio is important to consider, for sure.
In your past reporting, have you been able to talk to victims' families after the execution?
I have not after. So tonight, you know, and I don't know what victims' families will be present. They're allowed to come if they want. And they are given a choice to speak to the media afterwards at the press conference. So I have spoken to victims' families in the run-up to executions before. And certainly based on my reporting and based on other reporting, great reporting that's been done on this issue, there are victims' families who feel any number of ways about this. Some of them have been waiting and they really want to see the person who killed their loved ones executed. Others are opposed to the death penalty. Others have even developed relationships with this person and forgiven them. I mean, but there's any story you can think of is out there. And I think it's definitely important for us not to speak about or think about victims' families as a monolith, because they run the spectrum. And again, I can't speak for them, but I've heard from them and I've seen their accounts elsewhere. And I know that they're kind of across the board in terms of how they feel about the death penalty and executions.
If you're just tuning in, this is Nashville, and I'm your host, Khalil Ekalona. We're talking this hour about capital punishment in Tennessee as the state prepares to carry out its first execution since 2020 tonight with the execution of Oscar Smith. Tweet us your questions at This Is Nashville. I'd like to welcome my next guest. Brad McLean is an attorney who has gotten several people off of death row over the course of his career. Brad, thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Oscar Smith has been on death row for 32 years, and that's a long time. Brad, what's the logic behind keeping someone on death row for that length of time?
Well, that's a good question. I'm not sure there's any logic to it. These cases take an extraordinarily long time to go through the courts. And I think what we have now is a backlog of old cases, and that the state is now pursuing to execution. It's interesting that while we have a number of execution dates scheduled for this year, I mean, I think there are 5 scheduled for this year, including the one scheduled for tonight for Oscar Smith, that while we have that many execution dates scheduled this year, we've had very few new death sentences in Tennessee. Over the past 10 years, there have only been 6 new cases where new death sentences have been imposed, and only 1 in the last 2 or 3 years. So, and you compare that with, for example, 1990, when Oscar Smith was sentenced to death. In that year alone, you had 10 death sentences imposed on 10 different defendants in 10 different cases. And interestingly, if we look at those cases, in 7 of those 10 cases, because of problems with the trial or problems with the case, the death sentences were set aside. So we only have 3 cases from that year, 1990, in which death sentences have been sustained. One of those defendants died on death row, and we have 2 who have pending death sentences. One is Oscar Smith, and the other is Harold Wayne Nichols, who is scheduled for execution in a few months. So, sort of it's kind of weird. It's really kind of an irony that while the death penalty is going out of existence in Tennessee because very few prosecutors are pursuing the death sentence, very few juries are imposing death sentences anymore. We have this backlog of cases, average about 30 years old. In Mr. Smith's case, his case is 32 years old. We had an execution, I think it was 2 years ago, where the case was 36 years old, I think it was. You have these old cases involving defendants who are themselves very old. Oscar Smith, as Steve mentioned, is 72 years old. The state is trying to execute. And as time goes on, the rationale behind the death penalty diminishes to the point of zero. If you look at the cases out of the U.S. Supreme Court, which have upheld the death penalty, there are 2 basic rationales for the death penalty. One is deterrence, and there are no studies that demonstrate that it has any deterrent effect whatsoever. And the other is retribution, and that's sort of a vague term, but this idea that somebody deserves what they've done in the form of an execution, that those 2 reasons or rationales diminish over time. If you don't execute somebody for 32 years after their trial, then the death penalty doesn't have much of a deterrent effect, if any. It never did, but it certainly has virtually no deterrent effect after that length of time. And the interest in retribution also diminishes, especially when people have lived for so long after their trial and they've changed. They change over time. So there's not really a rationale for executing people after this length of time. And it's particularly ironic that we're executing so many people in a time when the death penalty is really dying on the vine.
To kind of refer to that, there was a 9-year break in capital punishment until the state resumed executions in 2018. What happened there?
Well, I think that number one, as I said before, it takes a long time for these cases to work their way through the system. But there were a number of execution dates that were set during that period of time, and then they were stayed primarily because of litigation over the lethal injection protocol, over the method of execution. And there were a number of cases that were litigated on that issue, both in federal court and state court, until finally, just a few years ago, Tennessee's current lethal injection protocol was upheld by the courts. So that caused a substantial delay of close to 10 years. And then there were a number of execution dates that were scheduled that were then delayed because of COVID. So now that we've gotten past the intense period of COVID, the court has rescheduled execution dates. So I think those are the 2 main reasons why there was that lapse of executions during that close to 10-year period.
What's been happening since 2018? Obviously, we had a few years of a break during the pandemic. But Brad, I'm curious, the state delivering more death sentences?
No, that's the point. The state is not delivering more death sentences. As I mentioned before, over the last 10 years, there have only been 6 new death sentences in the state of Tennessee. There was 1 new death sentence last year. I don't think there were any the year before that. And so, as I said, prosecutors are not pursuing death sentences. In the few cases that go to trial, juries are not imposing death sentences for the most part. So over the last 10 years, we've had 6 new death sentences. Interestingly, in the middle section of Tennessee, the middle third of Tennessee that includes Davidson County and the surrounding counties, there was not a single new death sentence from the year 2001 until last year. So we went 20 years in the middle section of Tennessee without any new death sentences at all. And then finally, there was one new death sentence, I think it was last year in Dixon County, and that's on appeal. But and then other parts of the state, the number of death sentences have also drastically declined. So I think the public can get a misperception when they read about or hear about the number of executions that are scheduled for this year, in perhaps thinking that the machinery of death is going full tilt, and it's not. Executions are going forward on these very, very old cases, but there aren't any new cases or very few new cases coming into the system. To just give you an idea, I mean, among those people who have been executed in Tennessee in the modern era, we reinstated the death sentence in 1977. Among those who have been executed, and I think there have been 13 so far, the average length of time from their trial, from when they were sentenced to death to when they're actually executed, is 28 years. And the average age is somewhere around 60 years old. And now we have, in the case of Oscar Smith, for example, someone who's 72 years old. And that average is going to increase as more executions take place, because these are all very old cases. So, for example, we have a case set for execution in August of someone who's been on death row for 33 years. We have someone else who's set for execution in October who's been on death row for 29 years, and another person is set for execution in December who's been on death row for 33 years. So, as I said, I mean, these are very, very old cases. We have twice as many people on death row who have died for reasons other than execution than we've executed. So that I hope answers the question.
It does. And I want to thank you for being here. That's longtime attorney Brad McLean. He was joined by journalist and criminal investigator Stephen Hale. Thank you both for joining us. We're taking a quick break. When we come back, we'll take a look at how Tennessee's history in capital punishment policies and practices compare to those of other states. Do you have questions about the death penalty in Tennessee? Tweet us at This Is Nashville. We'll be right back. I'm Khalil Ekolona, and this is Nashville. Riverbend Maximum Security Prison currently holds all of Tennessee's men on death row. It's also the location where prisoners were executed when their time comes. This past Sunday, about 50 people met in a parking lot across the street. There was music and prayer. There was also a display. 14 portraits of Christ painted by men on death row. The paintings represented the Stations of the Cross, or the timeline of Jesus' last day, from conviction to being placed in a tomb. The gathering looked a lot like a small outdoor church, but it wasn't any ordinary Easter service. The crowd was gathered to march from the prison to War Memorial Plaza in downtown Nashville, carrying signs and banners opposing the death penalty. Our producer, Tasha A.F. Lemley, was there as an opening service of March for Mercy wrapped up and the march began.
Lift up, 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 lift up. If killing is wrong, why do the state murder people? I'm saying.
Common hymnal, they kick off the march with a piece they say is about the dignity of life, what they love and what they fight for. Co-writer Shane Claiborne is an activist and author, and one of the organizers for today's march.
As we walk, even if people say mean things to us, we return it with love. Amen? Like we're not going to mirror anything ugly that's said to us, so we'll keep that spirit of love and nonviolence. We're going to stay very carefully on the right side. We're going to go down, make a big U-turn, and then the march will all start together, and we're going to go for it, all right?
Riverbend is quiet from the outside. There are a few guards near the road who leave protesters alone, and everyone moves on. It's going to be a long day. We pass through industrial zones, go through the nations, across TSU, and up Jefferson Street to Rosa Parks. The weather is cool, which is helpful, and there's only a little bit of rain. This is the fourth walk like this, all organized just before a scheduled execution. And this week, after more than a 2-year pause, Oscar Smith is scheduled to die. And marchers believe there has to be another way.
I actually know some of the people who are scheduled to be executed.
This is Pai Masavasut's first March for Mercy. He used to take classes inside death row as part of his studies at Vanderbilt.
We develop such good relationships with the people inside, and we exchange our perspective, and they mean a lot to us and we mean a lot to them. I grew more frustrated when the religion that I belong to, which is Christianity, sometimes support or become a main driver of these punishments.
That's a sentiment Shane shares. He says the Bible Belt is the death belt, and the death penalty would not stand a chance in America if it weren't for the support of Christians.
And it being Easter, almost all of these governors and legislators, are in church today celebrating the defeat of death, the empty tomb. And then it's so apparent that we've missed the whole point of it sometimes. If you're going to carry out an execution right after Easter, you might not understand the point of the crucifixion and the resurrection, I think, right? And we know Jesus said, "Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy." So it feels like a very powerful way to celebrate Easter together by saying the resurrection was not just a one-time event 2,000 years ago, but something that should reorient the whole way we think about violence and execution and what mercy really requires of us,
After more than 3 hours of walking, we get to War Memorial Plaza, where there's more prayer, music, and meditation on the Stations of the Cross. There's also calls for change. Community organizer Justin Jones, who's running for State House, he says the place we're standing is a place memorializing death and violence.
My question as we gather here in the center of Nashville, where are the Christians? Where are the conservative Christians who are so loud every day in this building talking about what books children should read in schools and talking about who should marry who? But where are you now when it comes to the lives of our brother who just a few days after Easter will be crucified by the state? Every time you crucify and harm the least of these, you are reenacting crucifixion. You are reenacting that public display of violence. And for what? And for what? There is no justice in state-sanctioned violence. There is no healing in this.
Joining us now is Reverend Stacey Rector, Director of Tennesseans for Alternatives to the Death Penalty. Stacey, welcome to This is Nashville.
Thank you, Khalil. I'm glad to be here today.
Thank you for being with us. So tell me, how has your faith and work as a minister shaped the way you think about the death penalty?
Well, my faith is really what led me to the issue. I was born and raised in Tennessee, and during that period, we weren't executing at all. So it wasn't something I gave much thought to. But when I went to seminary, I was in Georgia, and Georgia was actively executing during that period of time in the early 90s. And I began to really have to wrestle with my understanding of who Jesus is and the life he calls us to, and his own death. And I just could not square that my life as a disciple of Jesus with the death penalty. And so that's really what moved me into this work. Obviously, as I've grown more in the work, I've learned a whole lot more about the policy of the death penalty, apart from one's moral or philosophical or biblical questions about it. As a policy, the death penalty is just a complete failure for our state. And so I've really been able to find common ground, though I have strong feelings about the death penalty and its morality and and where I stand as a Christian on it. Others don't see it that way all the time, right? And so what I have found is even when we don't see eye to eye from our faith perspective or from our moral perspective, we are finding much more common ground on the fact that this policy is simply failing us.
You know, I'm interested in the faith, the ability not to see people eye to eye on that. You know, what in your arguments with other Christians and victims' rights organizers, what are they saying in favor of the death penalty?
Well, there are certainly Christian denominations who have positions where they believe the death penalty is biblically justified. They use Levitical law in that justification. They use text from Paul and Romans for that justification. So there are texts. Obviously, everybody can find texts that that maybe support their position. So there definitely are scriptures that you could look at and make that argument. I try to look at scripture as a whole and really through the lens of Jesus. And for me, that is how I interpret the whole of scripture. And so that gives me a certain position on the death penalty. But it is really fascinating to me that as I have taught to people, and again, people who philosophically or biblically just disagree with me and say that you can justify the death penalty biblically, where I find that common ground is as they learn more about the way the death penalty is administered today, the unfair application, the arbitrary application, the extreme cost to the state, to taxpayers, dollars we're not spending on things that actually promote public safety and actually support victims of violence. When they consider the real risk of executing innocent people, when they begin to consider everything in its totality, what I discover is they don't see the death penalty of today as being able to be done in a way that's very just. And so that's where I find more common ground, as opposed to whether we can sit down and lob scriptures at each other about about whether this is biblically justifiable or not. I find at this point it more helpful to say, where can we find the common ground and agree that what we're doing now, the death penalty system of today, is a failure. It doesn't make us safer. It risks executing innocent people. It's unfairly applied. And it puts the surviving family members of murder victims through decades of legal process, and I would say added trauma.
I want to talk to you about that. I want to talk about that trauma. There's a lot of trauma involved here and all around for victims' families and for the folks on death row. Tell me about that.
Well, again, and you've heard others say this earlier in the program, that I can certainly not speak for people who have lost loved ones to murder, for those on death row or their families, and for what that trauma has been like. What I can do is tell you what I have been told by people who have been through the process, who've experienced it, both those who support the death penalty in terms of the victims' family members and those who don't. What I hear over and over again is that this protracted system that goes on for decades traps people in a trauma space. It traps them in that moment of their worst pain, their worst outrage, their worst brokenness, and they cannot get out of it because they are constantly being brought back to court. They're constantly being reliving it in the media. Dates are being set, dates are being stayed. This goes on and on and on and on. And so what I hear from both sides, people may have different opinions about what we should do about that. But what I hear is that this process we have is so damaging. And I would argue it's damaging, obviously, for those on death row to go through it and for their families to be going through this all these years and years and years. However, what we also know is our system is not working properly, and that it is taking 30 plus years sometimes to actually address issues of innocence.
And
You know, we have had people
that's a
in
lot of trauma
process
for
for
people
30
to
years
be in. I
who,
understand.
you know,
I
yeah, so it is a traumatic thing that we don't have to go through because we have alternatives.
My next guest is a pretty good sharp on grasp on the national perspective. Liliana Segura writes about the death penalty for The Intercept, and she lives here in Nashville. Liliana, thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
So can you tell me quickly, like, where does Tennessee stack up against other states that use capital punishment?
You know, it's interesting. At first glance, because we have these scheduled executions, because Tennessee has carried out a number of executions after this long pause, it would seem like Tennessee is disproportionately sort of devoted to the death penalty in a way that other states are not. And that's really not the case, actually, historically, especially compared to other states in the South. Tennessee was never actually a leader when it came to carrying out the death penalty. And in fact, where we are now, I mean, Brad spoke about this a little bit. We're in this kind of really bizarre space when it comes to the death penalty in this country, widely speaking. You know, year after year after year, the data all over the country, including in active death penalty states like Texas, shows that there are fewer and fewer and fewer new death sentences being imposed. Jurors are increasingly, opting for other sentences aside from the death penalty, and there are also fewer and fewer executions being carried out. And yet you see these moments, like in Tennessee, like in a state I think about a lot during Easter season, Arkansas, which in 2017 decided to try to make use of its particular drug, midazolam, to carry out a whole bunch of executions over Holy Week. I did reporting there. You see these moments, including in the federal system, which I reported on a lot between 2020 and 2021. After years, something like 16 years, the federal system, which hadn't carried out an execution in a long, long time, decided that it was going to carry out what ended up being 13 executions over a 6-month period. So there's this weird contradiction where you see this death penalty on the decline, and yet these moments where there's just this frenzy to kill in states including Tennessee. So it's pretty ugly, but the sort of long view is that this is something that really is on its way out. I did want to add, just picking up on what Stephen was sharing and what you were discussing about those who are tasked with killing people on death row. Somebody I was able to meet in Terre Haute, Indiana, which is where they carry out the federal executions, I had a chance to meet a man named Jerry Givens. Jerry Givens was for years the executioner in the state of Virginia. He carried out 62 executions in Virginia, and afterwards came to a point where he was haunted by that work, where he became actually a dedicated anti-death penalty activist who would speak out wherever he could, including in Terre Haute, in advance of the federal executions, to say, this isn't the way, this essentially, impacted my life in ways that haunt me to this day. Jerry Givens unfortunately died of COVID in the spring of 2020, but I did want to share that. He was a really important voice in the broader movement.
Lethal injection is the default method for executions. And Stephen mentioned earlier that the state gives those convicted before 1999 the choice to die by electric chair. And in recent years, several people have selected the electric chair, citing fears that the drugs may cause them more pain. Liliana, can you tell us about the complications of lethal injection?
Yeah, and Stephen did touch on this. This has been the source of a ton of litigation going back years, more than a decade, really, when it comes to lethal injection specifically. Without getting too much into the weedy legal history, essentially what's happened is since the beginning, since the death penalty has been carried out, we've always been in search of some better method, some more humane method, something that might not look so much like this thing that we're doing. And that was true with the advent of the electric chair. That was even true with hanging. That was true, and so we get to this point where lethal injection was invented by a pathologist in Oklahoma who very explicitly designed it to make it look humane, but more for the benefit of those viewing doing it. Unfortunately, the drugs that he chose did have the appearance, did make an execution look a little more palatable, but there was actually never a whole lot of evidence that it was reliably rendering a person insensate so that they wouldn't feel the torturous effects of the drugs that were being used to kill them. And so that's led to a lot of litigation and a situation where a number of people who are condemned have chosen alternatives, including electrocution. And I think a lot of Americans do not understand that that's something that's happening right now in our so-called modern era of the death penalty.
That is Liliana Segura, reporter. She was joined by Reverend Stacey Rector. Thank you both for being with us today. I wish we had more time. Thanks to everyone who tuned in this hour. Tomorrow, it's Earth Day, so we're going to be talking about green space. What is it exactly, and why is it important? Tune in. This is Nashville is a production of WPLN and Nashville Public Radio. Listen back at thisisnashville.org or wherever you get your podcasts. Our producers are Steve Harush, Rose Gilbert, and Tasha A.F. Lemley. Our digital lead is Anna Gallegos Cannon. Michaela Elias is our technical director. Our executive producer is Andrea Tudhope. Masterminds behind our music are Laurent and Namir Blade. Special thanks to Kelly Gleason. And the conversation does not end here. We want to hear your thoughts about today's episode. Tweet us at This Is Nashville. You can find us on Facebook and Instagram. And please fill out our survey online. This is Nashville. I'm Khalil A. Colonna. We'll see you tomorrow, everybody. And be good to each other.